Okay, so I'll start. Thank you to the organizers of this conference. I think it's very, very important that we talk together about all of the issues listed in this conference, and that we begin the conference about the tasks of revolutionary socialists today in the US by analyzing the international situation. Because the war that is happening in Ukraine, I think we'll all agree, has a tremendous impact in the tasks and the prospects of what's going to happen in the world in the next years to come. We are right now in the third month of the war in Ukraine, of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And the war is accelerating what we could call the crisis of the old order of world imperialism. And it's posing a great challenge for all revolutionaries to first understand the nature of this war, because there's a big debate about what kind of war it is. And second, to analyze our tasks. What do we need to do as revolutionaries in this war? And one of the great things from our tradition, revolutionary socialist tradition and Trotskyism, is that we can learn a tremendous amount from previous wars and the debates and positions that Trotskyists took in these wars. So first of all, how do we understand the Ukraine war? One of the points that brings us together here in this conference is that as revolutionary socialists, we have rejected the campist framing, that this is just merely a proxy war of imperialisms, and that we should either accept that Russia had the right to invade Ukraine because of NATO expansion, or to remain neutral in this war, as is the working class has no side in this war. We understand this war as a war of national liberation against Russian imperialist aggression. But that definition is not enough, because this war is not occurring in a vacuum. It's occurring in a very particular qualitative situation, which is a growing rivalry between imperialisms. And we have a rising imperialism of China, which is consolidating a Eurasian bloc, which is increasingly being confronted with a Western US-led imperialism. So we have a situation where we have a war of national liberation, which requires that revolutionaries take the stand to defend the national sovereignty of Ukraine, which is a position we have taken historically, but at the same time understand that this war is being used by US imperialism and European imperialism to advance its own interest. And believe it or not, this is not the first time in history where we have these kind of wars that seem simple, but in fact are very complicated. In the prelude to World War II, which started officially in 1939, there were two wars with very similar characteristics. First, there was a second Italo-Ethiopian war that began in 1935, where fascist Italy from Mussolini invaded Ethiopia, which was one of the few countries in Africa which was not under colonial domination. And in that context, the Great Britain and France launched a campaign against Italy, very similar to the one the US is launching against Russia. We are democracies, you're dictatorships, we must post all sanctions against Italy, right? But that war helped to start realigning the different imperialist forces that then 4 years later will like have it at World War II. And that war was very short. But then there was a second war very important for us, which is the war between China and Japan, where Japan invaded China in 1937. And the US also intervened in 1941 to give material aid. And it was also a war of national liberation against Japanese imperialism that got combined with World War II. And I'm not going to give here a history lesson. I'm going to talk about Ukraine. But I think it's very important for us, because we have a huge task ahead to learn from our history, to go and read the debates of the 1930s, because we can find there a treasure of programmatic debates, of political orientations. This is not the first time where revolutionaries in an imperialist country had to support a just war with a progressive side, and at the same time, be absolutely independent of their own imperialism and denounce their own imperialism. And it's a complicated thing to do. How, on the one hand, we're not with the liberals, right, who are siding with Biden, who are supporting the sanctions, who are giving uncritical support to NATO expansion, and we're not either with the campists, we're saying this is just inter-imperialist aggression. And this sophistication and dialectical understanding of the class struggle is part of our tradition, and we must connect with it. And in the United States, it's part of the history of the Socialist Workers' Party and the huge amount of writing and elaboration of the 30s. So let's understand a little bit more what is happening today in Ukraine. So we understand this war as a war of imperialist aggression of Russia on Ukraine. And when we say imperialist domination, we mean that the Russian monopolies, the gas, energy monopolies, the banking monopolies had encroached in the Ukraine economy to control it. In the same way, they had done the same thing in many of the former USSR republics. But that domination, and I would say domination is like 40% of the banks were controlled by Russia before 2014. That Russian domination of Ukraine was contested in 2014 with the Maidan social explosions. And we cannot understand the invasion today if we do not understand the encroachment and pushback of imperialist domination of Ukraine, of Russia in Ukraine, and the fact that Ukraine is today under dispute, right? Between either it becomes a semi-colony of Russia or it becomes a semi-colony of the European Union and NATO. So this is an important framing, because we also need to do a scientific study of the economic forces and motives behind the war. We hear a lot in the news that what happened is that Putin just went crazy. He was isolated too much under COVID and he's out of touch. Like, listen, Putin is not going crazy. Putin is carrying out a specific political project that corresponds to the interest of the ruling class in Russia. And Zelensky also has his projects of defending the interest of the nascent comprador bourgeoisie in Ukraine, which is trying to see to which sector is going to do allegiance. And the speeches of Macron in France or of Biden in the US about the defense of democracy and human rights, we know not to be fooled that there is nothing about that behind the intervention in this war. It is also a war to control the Eastern Europe for the European and the US imperialist powers. Now, the US has very, very quickly become involved in this war, right? 2 weeks after the invasion, everything was ready, and the government has approved 2 huge packages, so-called to aid Ukraine. And what is contained in these packages, comrades? It is a mixed match of things with a very clear goal: to advance the interest of US imperialism in Ukraine and Eastern Europe. Because of course there was food and medical supplies, and who can object to sending food and medical supplies to Ukraine? And there was military aid that was very much needed for the resistance. But the weapons that were sent to the Ukrainians, they were not the weapons the Ukrainians demanded and needed. They were the old weapons that were stationed in Russia in the Eastern Europe from the Soviet time, from the Cold War time. And actually what the 2 packages that Biden passed have done is that they have helped build new weapons for the US and replenish the own stock of weapons, because the US is in a huge race for rearmament against competing with China, and has been able to push the other European powers to go in the same direction. But in these packages of so-called aid, there is also the expansion of NATO, putting more troops in Europe, sending more soldiers to Europe, and the economic sanctions. So what these packages have done, and why we need to denounce them as revolutionaries in the US, is that the policy of Biden is not about aiding the Ukrainian people. It is subordinated any kind of aid to enrolling and enlisting and supporting the US imperialist project, putting more troops on the ground, putting economic sanctions and warfare against Russia to advance the interest of the United States. So let's talk a little bit about what these sanctions are about, because there's a big debate here in Europe also about should we do the embargo of oil? Should we cut the incoming of cash of Russia so the invasion stops? Look, the discussion here about the oil and gas is used by the United States to advance its own interest in the dispute of the energy markets. We're in the midst of an environmental collapse. We've been discussing the climate crisis over and over. And in the middle of this war, what is happening is that the US is pushing for the oil and gas embargo to force the European countries to cut the supply, the importing gas, liquefied gas and oil from Europe, because it wants to sell its own LNG gas, liquefied gas. And liquefied gas is very polluting, number one. The emissions of methane are very threatening. But number two, like the deal that Biden did in the middle of the war, Biden traveled and signed a deal with the Europeans and said, stop buying the gas from Russia and buy our gas from the US. Since the beginning of the war, the production of liquefied gas and fracking in the United States has boomed. The corporations, these new corporations like Cheniere or Tellurian or Chevron, who controls a lot of the gasification ports, are doing record profits. So when Biden says we need to have these sanctions against Russia because we're for democracy, what he's doing is using the war to advance the interest of the US monopolies of energy and a nascent market, which is the market of liquefied gas, and which is considered a so-called clean transition fuel, to displace Russia and make business with the Europeans. And we must be absolutely opposed to that. Also because it's a huge threat to the environment. When Biden came to power, he promised kind of half-half that he will stop the fracking and exploration of drilling of oil and gas on federal land. What happened during the war? What happened in April of 25th? This ban was removed. And today in the US, we're fracking like never. These companies are making money. Armament companies are making money, energy companies are making money. So we must denounce and explain to the US working class that their government here is not the island of the Ukrainian people. And we need to have an independent working class policy on this. And we need also to explain, because the government has said it very clearly, that their military goals in Ukraine are not to help win this war quick. So Russia is defeated very quick. This is not the goal. The goal was, when Secretary of State Austin, the defense secretary, went to Europe, and he said it, we are here because we want to weaken Russia. We're launching a war of attrition. We want this to be a prolonged war. We're sending equipment and growing equipment and increasing equipment because we want the Ukrainian resistance, the working class, its army, to deplete our main competitor here, because Russia has a second army in the world, and Russia is an ally of China. So our role as revolutionaries is, first of all, to do a scientific analysis of what is at play in this war and represent the interests of the working class, which is the interest of the working class in the US, which is the same interest as the working class in Ukraine and the working class in Russia. And if we're unable to explain this and to counter not only the campist propaganda, sometimes we're really worried about the campists, but they're insignificant. Their influence of Stalinists in the working class is very small. We need to counter the offensive propaganda of the government that is trying to convince us that they're doing this to support the Ukrainian people. And we need to say, absolutely not. Here are the facts. You're saying it yourself. You could not care less about the Ukrainian people. You are here to advance your own interests, the interests of monopolies, the same monopolies that are hurting and destroying the lives of working class people in the US and are damaging the environment. So I want to talk a little bit about what we need to do here in the US, because it is a complicated situation. We launched a platform with several important demands, but we have been unable to mobilize for actions. But let's go back to the demands. First, we start saying we demand the immediate withdrawal of Russian troops. Like in a war, we have a side, and yes, we want to see Russia defeated and retreated outside of the territory of Ukraine, out of Crimea, out of Donbass, etc. Second, we give support, political support to the Ukrainian resistance, and we defend the right of self-defense, including using the weapons NATO gave them. And we can have a discussion about this, but if you're in a war, you need weapons, and you're not gonna start picking which weapons you get from. What we need to be very clear in the United States is we need to politically denounce why US imperialism is arming the resistance. And we need to explain that it's not arming the resistance because it wants to see clearly flourishing working class take up arms and fight Zelensky, take power. It's arming the resistance because it wants to, through this war, weaken and defeat its military opponent, Russia. So we need to continue supporting the Ukrainian resistance. And we need to be very clear that we oppose all imperialist sanctions, that there is no way out, even also through negotiations and peace deal, that the only way out in this war is class struggle. And class struggle means the defeat of the Russian invasion and the victory of the Ukrainian working class. So here in the US, we can only do this if we build a political party, because we have seen that this is the third month of the war and we're in a huge amount of disarray. We had maybe 1 day of mobilization in this country. Could you believe it? And why workers are not taken to the streets? Because they're convinced that for once their government is on the good side of war. So what we need to propose here in the United States is an independent working class way out in this war. And only us can do it. Only us, through our analysis, our understanding, we can do it. We need to use the points of unity that we agree on to start building for actions, to start building for mobilizations, not just to find ourselves the leftists because we love each other and we don't have anything to do in the weekend just to hang out. We need to bring this discussion to our class, to our unions, to the youth groups, to the student groups in the universities, to the community organizations, to the immigrant rights movement, to the Black Lives Matter, to the abortion rallies. We need to build an anti-imperialist and an internationalist consciousness in the heads of the working class in this country and have it expressed through action, not only words, through action. And the second thing we need to do, and our party has been doing it, is to collect solidarity and support to the Ukrainian resistance. Because workers today in Ukraine, in the unions, in the youth groups, they're arming themselves to defend their country and fight for their lives. And we have collected $5,000 we have sent to a Ukrainian miners' union, an independent union in Kryvyi Rog in the east of Ukraine, which is part of this network social movement Ukraine, which is a collection of unions, activists, that is independent from the Zelensky administration, that has been mobilizing against the neoliberal reforms of Zelensky. We need to build these relations of active solidarity between the different sectors of the working class. And we need to do the same thing with the anti-war activists of our class in Russia. We need to start building this class and we need to support each other. We need to express our solidarity. We cannot just think of the war in Ukraine from the United States, okay? And this is a very important part of our mission, that we need to insist that the way out in this crisis, in this war, is one, independent working class action, anti-imperialist, and also internationalist in action, solidarity in action. In Ukraine, the most important thing right now to win the war is to have the development of independent militias from the Zelensky government. Because believe it or not, in the middle of this war, what has Zelensky done? We see him in the media, like giving these big speeches, asking for more weapons, pleading to the West. We also have seen making videos of himself, but nobody's talking about something criminal this government has done. Before the war, he was already planning laws to privatize the land, to privatize public services, and our comrades in Ukraine, the ones we're working with and fundraising for, they were fighting these reforms. And there was a reform that he wanted to pass, which was a labor reform, to strip Ukrainian workers and unions of the rights they had, very few rights. He couldn't pass it before the war, but he has passed it in the middle of the war. He has upended and suspended the labor code and the labor law. And today, with the emergency labor law, you know, Ukrainian workers, they're forced to go to work, even in war zones. And if they don't go to work, they lose their job. They're forced to work 60 hours a week, not 40 hours a week. They can lose their job and be fired with no cause. And if their company today is claiming that they're not making profits, they don't need to pay the workers. This is what the Zelensky government is doing. And this is why we need to organize the Ukrainian working class and support any element that is clearly breaking independently from it. We need to support them and we need to build international solidarity, because our class only has a way out in this crisis. And this is the first of many wars we're going to see, because we're living in a world of inter-imperialist rivalry. And it is the historic moment we need to come together to build an organization here in the United States that can connect the different sectors of our class to fight. But also we need to do the same thing at the international level. And this is something I want to say here, because I'm not just from Workers' Voice, we're affiliated to the International Workers' League, is that we need to start thinking, when we think about our task as revolutionaries, the importance of organization, that we also need to think that this is an international organization that we need to be building. So we start connecting the different sectors of our class to fight. So I know I've spoken a lot, 18 minutes, and I want to leave more time for discussion and less time for speeches. So I'm going to shut up, and I'm very eager to hear what our comrade Bill Mullen has to say about Palestine. So thank you very much, comrades, for having me here today in this important conference.
Yeah, thanks, Ben. Thank you, Blanca. That was tremendous. And welcome, comrades from all across the world. I'm standing here giving these remarks in the wake of the murder of Palestinian journalist Shireen Abu Akleh, who was, as many of you know, assassinated by the Israeli Defense Forces just a few weeks ago, with bullets and guns that were paid for by the United States. And I want to talk about two things today: why it's so critical for us on the revolutionary socialist left to put Israel's ongoing war against the Palestinian people at the center of our analysis of US imperialism and our efforts to rebuild a socialist movement. I have to begin by saying, I think the best way to think about the US relationship to Israel is as a 75-year ongoing war against an indigenous working class Palestinian population. Since 1948, Israel has been the single largest receiver of US foreign aid, more than $150 billion, okay? In 2016, as many of you know, liberal President Barack Obama signed one of the largest foreign aid package in the history of the United States, promising $38 billion a year in military aid to Israel between for the years 2017 to 2028. All of this under the auspices of declaring Israel what the US calls a major non-NATO ally. But the road to US foreign aid to Ukraine passes through Israel. Israel has been, since the middle of the 20th century, I would argue, the primary conduit by which the United States has allocated weapons, dollars, and money to kill its enemies. To bring it to right up to the current moment, since the Biden administration took power in February of 2021, the United States approved new F-35 and F-15 fighter jets to send to Israel. In March of 2022, as many of you know, Congress approved the largest funding package for Israel in history, which included $1 billion in emergency funding for Iron Dome, the famous so-called defense system that turns back rockets, Palestinian rockets in particular. That vote, as many of you know, brought enormous attention to the weaknesses of socialist reformism in the United States when DSA member Jamal Bowman voted for that aid package. And we might talk a little bit about in the discussion about how exactly we as revolutionary socialists understand that as a catastrophe for our side. Those are some of the facts, I think, that substantiate what I would call the 75-year endless war that the US supports against the indigenous Palestinian population. It's also important for us on the left to think about this war as a settler colonial war. What the United States and Israel share, in addition to being brutal capitalist imperialist states, is a history of settler colonialism. The Palestinians are the indigenous people of a land that has been taken out from under them since 1948. In fact, the Zionist project, which is a racist colonial project, really emerges in the 1890s, almost identical with the broad expansion of US empire. Think about 1898, the US seizes Guam, the Philippines, Cuba, Hawaii. Meanwhile, Theodore Herzl, the leader of the Zionist movement, is beginning a campaign, a 50-year campaign to move Jewish settlers from Eastern Europe, from Western Europe, from all parts of the diaspora into Palestine to reconquer that land, to build what the Zionists called a new city, a flowering city on a land that they considered to be literally unoccupied, as if Palestinians did not exist in the landscape of 1910, 1920, 1930 Palestine. And this joint narrative of settler colonialism is really critical. It helps us understand a particular characteristic of US imperialism. It helps us understand why, for example, the BDS movement is also founded on the South African BDS movement, South Africa being another settler colonial state. We have to really, in our analysis, center this question, because I think for a lot of Americans, it gets lost in the translation of what exactly is the character of US support for Israel and why that support is there. I mentioned, for example, the Zionist project, which is so resonant for us of the way the US in the 19th century just obliterated American Indians from the land as they moved west, right? That settler colonialism was part of the primitive accumulation process of the building of capitalism in the United States, just as it was for the Zionist project in Israel, right? It's really, really important, I think, that we center in on this to actually understand that American Zionism and Israeli Zionism are part and parcel of the same political project of land expropriation, population transfer, population extermination, genocide, in effect. A very, very important article for comrades who may be looking to read something on the history of Zionism was published years ago in the International Socialist Journal by Annie Levin called A Hidden History of Zionism. And I recommend that piece because it actually shows us the argument that I'm making here today that Zionism was always a nation-building project. It always had an imperial pro-capitalist character. It was also a project that was meant to be an alternative to revolutionary socialism. The Zionists were as opposed to the Bolsheviks in Russia as were the British empires and the American empires, right? So for us as revolutionary socialists, Zionism has been a long-time enemy of our project to be a radical working class alternative to something like settler colonialism in Palestine. Uh, a key moment for us, and I'm just going to make a couple more historical notes in thinking about the U.S.-Israel relationship in particular, is 1967, the so-called Six-Day War, when Israel annexed the Golan Heights, the Sinai Peninsula, the Gaza Strip, and the West Bank. This was a huge turning point. The U.S. had already identified Israel as a primary proxy for military and oil interests in the Middle East, raised its support by 450% after the Six-Day War. Military aid went from 7 million in 1967 to 25 million in 1968. This is, what was critical about this was the US and Israel simultaneously expanding their territory and terrain in the Middle East, creating a permanent condition of warfare between Israel and its neighboring states like Jordan and Syria, from which it had annexed land, and making the US the primary partner in this project. Since 1967, as many of you know, the other primary political development was the 1993 Oslo Accord, an accord which, on the face of it, has almost completely disabled some of the potential for Palestinian resistance to the Israeli settler project. It not only reduced the amount of land that was controlled by Palestinians, which was already a significant, but it had a tremendously negative effect on the Palestinian working class. Between 1992 and 1996, Palestinian employment in Israel declined from 116,000 to about 28,000 workers. Earnings from work in Israel collapsed from 25% of Palestinian GNP to about 6%. Along with this came Israel is also one of the leading neoliberal states in the world. Ali Abu Nima and Adam Hania have both written really, really well about this. Israel began to turn to so-called foreign labor, especially from places like Saudi Arabia and Bahrain, bringing in low-wage workers to undercut Palestinian labor, especially in work like construction, bricklaying, things that had been staples of the Palestinian working class economy. So this overall portrait has made what we might call indigenous working class resistance really, really difficult, really, really difficult. And I want to talk a little bit about how and why some of the left's motions to support Palestine are so important in three different ways that are relevant to our discussion today. The first is this: since the United States invaded and began bombing Iraq in 2003, the largest anti-war demonstrations in the Western world have taken place in opposition to Israeli bombings of Palestinians. Remember that in 2007 and 2008, and in 2014, Operation Protective Edge and Operation Cast Lead, there were more than 100,000 people in the streets of London protesting these bombings. There were tens of thousands of people in places like New York City and Chicago. Why is this? Because I would argue since about 2003, when we had the development of Students for Justice in Palestine chapters across the United States, Israel has become a primary way of explaining American imperialism to people who live in this country. Much like the Vietnam War did in the late 1960s, people have understood the imperial character of the United States by seeing American-paid bombs dropping on innocent people in Gaza. There is an incipient anti-war edge to Palestinian liberation struggle and in the international struggle for Palestinian liberation. I think it has to be central to our efforts to rebuild an anti-war movement, including an anti-war movement against Russia's imperial war in the Ukraine. We have to, as internationalists, make connections for people about the character of imperial war the character of the imperial war in Russia, the character of US imperial war against Palestinians in Palestine. And I say that because I feel very strongly, especially if you've been on college campuses in the last 20 years, that Palestine really has become a prism, right, to explain the way US power and ruling class power works, also the way the racial character of that war. So I would make one note here for those of us involved in anti-war work. Remember and how some of those protests that we have helped build, right, as revolutionary socialists in the last 20 years for Palestine, how we did that and how we can connect that work to new anti-war struggles. The second terrain, which I think is critical for the revolutionary left, is the boycott, divestment, sanctions campaign. Remember, this was an indigenous campaign started by Palestinian civil society in 2004, modeled on the South African BDS movement, which eventually dismantled apartheid. What's critical about BDS? One, it's an easy internationalist movement to develop. Almost all of the countries in the world now, from South Africa to the United States to Spain, have very vital BDS campaigns. The demands of the BDS movement are meant to damage capitalist interests who invest in and profit off of the occupation, and to damage Israel's reputation in the world as a settler colonial regime. Those demands being the return of all stolen Arab lands, the dismantling of the apartheid wall, the extension of equal rights to all Palestinians, and finally, very critically, the guarantee of the UN guaranteed right of return of Palestinian refugees, something that Oslo made especially difficult. You want to know why every day you pick up the paper and say Israel is building a new settlement? It's so that they can reduce the chances of Palestinians returning to Palestine. Every inch of land they grab now cuts off that vital hope for return of the 5 million Palestinians in the diaspora, okay? So as revolutionary socialists, BDS offers us an immediate international tool for solidarity, for class struggle, and for the defense of the right of refugees to return to their homeland. Thirdly, and I think this is really critical, well, let me say one more thing about BDS. When the Arab Spring unfolded in 2011, obviously, as revolutionary socialists, we were tremendously excited to see parties like the Revolutionary Socialist in Egypt leading a class struggle against an autocratic Egyptian state. But just as that struggle was unfolding, as it unfolded, the Palestinian liberation movement was resurfacing in Cairo. Right? The BDS movement was just beginning to resurface. It was exactly to crush that kind of solidarity between revolutionaries in Egypt and Palestinians that the counter-revolution took place in Egypt in 2011. And in fact, since 2011, if you've been paying attention to what the media calls the so-called Abraham Accords, Israel is now signing free trade agreements with Arab states across the region, the UAE, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Sudan, and Morocco. This is potentially devastating for Palestinian liberation. This isolates Palestinians. This is part of Israel's neoliberal project. Adam Hania says that national liberation struggle has been conquered in the Middle East by neoliberalism. These Arab states at one time, remember Nasser in 1956, right? The fact that Egypt is now signing free trade agreements with Israel, right, shows us how much independent working class struggle across the Middle East is really critical, right, to combat this behemoth of capital neoliberal cooperation. So we need to think about our own struggles here as part of a resistance to that phenomenon. We think neoliberalism is bad here. Try being a Palestinian, okay? And lastly, and really critically, many of us who have been involved in Black Lives Matter protests over the last 10 years virtually, remember at Ferguson how the Black Palestine Solidarity Movement emerged as we realized that the Ferguson and St. Louis police departments had been trained in Israel, right? Trained to chokehold and shoot down Palestinians now doing the same thing to African Americans. I'm sure many of you remember Palestinians tweeting out to African Americans in Ferguson how to deal with the tear gas, right, which was being used against them, the same tear gas that is used to put down Palestinian protests in Palestine. This moment of interracial, anti-racist solidarity, okay, is so important, I think, for us to regather, right? Every, I think, Black Lives Matter protest has to recover the Palestinian struggle as part of a tradition of an indigenous, anti-racist politics. It helped move the movement forward enormously, as you will recall. So I just, somebody just said I'm jiggling. I'm sorry about that. It helped the movement, both move the Black Lives Matter movement forward, and it helped move forward the Palestinian liberation struggle. The work that's being done right now around deadly exchange, right, for example, which is the joint training of US cops and Israeli cops, is important to that work. And I know there's a lot of organizations and maybe even people here who are doing that work. I think it's absolutely critical that we continue to do that. My last thought is this: we really cannot rebuild, as we're here to do this weekend, we really cannot rebuild a revolutionary socialist current in the United States without placing US imperial aggression against the Palestinian people at the center of our internationalism. Thanks a lot.